Hello, 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 and welcome back to Tea, Coffee, Water. I am your host, Natalie Poindexter, and this coffee series, we have Michelle joining us again. So excited to have you back again, Michelle. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Today we're gonna do a little something funky, and I'm a planner. I love planning everything, and we're throwing a wrench in the game because I think we have some just really juicy topics to touch and talk about today. And I'm going to bring in some pieces that we talked about with Greg. And I'd just love to hear your feedback, your ideas, your experience. And, we talked about the state of nonprofits and the whole idea that more entrepreneurs are wanting to start nonprofits. And I got Greg's insight on that. I got your insight on that. And so I'm just really interested because one of the comments Greg made was, we don't need another nonprofit in our underserved communities. What we need is a for-profit entity that is capable of capacity building, right? Of bringing new jobs into the community, of hiring people that are willing to do the work, that know what their community needs, but also like bringing in that funding stream of, we are going to have services that are paid for, right, from like bigger outside entities, and letting that money trickle into the community. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think about that, right? Like, as a nonprofit extraordinaire and guru, where you're like, are we cutting out the idea, or how do we mesh that in? How do we, encourage that mindset? I know we've talked about mindset shifts. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, so kudos to Greg for giving us such a thought-provoking question to kick off with. So thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, I hear him on definitely the fact that we don't need any more nonprofits. And I think that just a simple, like, I agree with you, suffices to that piece. On the piece of, would it be helpful for an outside for-profit entity to come in and maybe lead the playbook, or to think more about giving funding, trickling it down? I feel in some ways in that scenario, we'd be very much in the same space we are now, which is we still have a lot of social change people, a lot of passionate people who don't have the relationships built to fully understand what the best collaboration looks like. And I think, like, in our defense, Natalie, though, it's hard, right? Because if you juxtapose us to the for-profit world, the for-profit world has the marketplace to tell you, yes, you're doing well with this product you're selling or service, or no, people hate it, nobody's buying it. And so you have this like touchstone to gauge your success by. And for us, we don't have that. And I think it's much harder for nonprofits to answer the question, is your service valuable and viable?
Ooh. So I want to play devil's advocate a little bit.
Do it.
Because I'm curious in that space, right? Is that not the role of the evaluation plan? Right? Is that not the role of like your one strategic plan in a way, but like, I guess I get two part of my question is that not the role of those items? But then on the other side, isn't there community data that's accessible? Like, I know you threw out so much data the last time we met. And then another metric that you mentioned is like 1 in 10 of jobs are tied to the nonprofit sector.
Yep.
So if we have these data sets that tell us that story, don't we have data sets to say if we're making a change in the community?
So yes and no. And I'll take one example to where I think if you're in the social change space, this statistic won't sound new to you. But for example, volunteer rates across the US have been in decline for like 10 years. Like, we know that, like, it's a trend now, like, it's probably going to continue to decline. There's a lot of things that you could talk about as to why that is.
Mm.
But my point, though, in pulling that out is, are we supposed to say the volunteer centers across America aren't doing their job?
Mm.
It's very complex. Like,
Yeah.
maybe I'm not saying they're not, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but it's, I think with the marketplace and with for-profit companies, it's just so much more decisive
Mhm.
that, you can tell where you need to make pivots and where you don't need to make pivots. Because
Mm.
with social change, all of these issues really like roll back up into systemic causes, right? Like
Mhm.
we're really looking at trying to change systems ultimately. Like, you could take it to any cause, whether it's like a food bank or environmental conservation.
Yeah.
And it just is so much more unclear,
Mm.
like
You know,
who's successful, who's not successful.
yes. So I'm so glad you mentioned food bank because um oh my gosh, it's so funny the synergy that happens amongst conversations. And you don't even know that it's happening. So Greg and I were having a conversation and he said he made a tough decision, and that was to close down their I think they had like an arm within their program where they served meals, but they had been serving meals since the 70s. And he's like, but we haven't addressed clearly the systemic problem. And so what we're doing is putting a piece of duct tape or a Band-Aid, so to speak, right? Whatever it might, this small little piece of something to
Right.
bridge this gap. But we are not, since the 70s, at 50 years, we haven't addressed the need within our community. And so I want to close that and I want to address the actual need in our community. Because yes, people need to get food, but like that's not helping them go beyond getting food, right? So I told him one, like that is um what I think is now being determined or called emotionally intelligent leadership.
Yep.
It's not saying we're going to keep doing this thing because look how good we're doing, because you've been doing it for 50 years, but you're doing the same exact thing. And I think like the part of like what you're saying with like the food bank, right? Like, how do we, and I know this will trickle into our education and access conversation, right? And as well as the volunteer side of things, but how do we get into the trenches of that systemic problem, right? Like feeding people is one thing, but increasing access to food. So like, I'm assuming that is like local ordinance, policies, maybe even state level policies that are needing to be affected. And if that is not a part of your mission as a nonprofit, then how can you get back to that root cause to support your community?
Yep. So for me, the answer comes in the visualization of an ecosystem. I always come back to this because I think as nonprofits, we don't necessarily see ourselves as operating within an ecosystem, but there's so many dynamics at play. And
Mm.
no one nonprofit is going to solve all of the issues around any cause, right? And nobody should expect you to. And I don't think anyone really expects you to. But the only way to make sure you're tackling that systemic issue from multiple sides, right, is to know who your partners are.
Mm.
And to know who your partners are, you have to, one, know what you're good at and what the unique value that you bring to that problem solving, but also be really real about maybe what you're not so good at.
Mm.
So for example, like with food insecurity, like maybe you are really good at the distribution piece. Like, you're feeding America, you're really good at the distribution piece and taking the donations and having a wide spread, but you're not tackling, how to make sure there's community gardens in,
uh,
under-resourced communities. Like, you can't do everything. But I
yeah.
think the thing I will fault us in is identifying who your close partners are and should be, because together, I think we can really make more impactful dents in these problems. But I do think we come at these social change problems with such an individualized or organizational goal and viewpoint that we forget to zoom out, and to realize like there's a wider team here. We're just on first base, but there's somebody else out there playing different roles, and we're just a team.
Yeah, you had mentioned like not having a unified voice in this sector, and like I think that's so interesting, right? Because just from some of the other data, the amount of funding that is brought through nonprofit organizations, the amount of nonprofit organizations that are across the country. And I know both you and Greg have mentioned like being a part of a network or like sitting at this table. And you mentioned it in the conservation side of things, where you find out you're sitting in this community space and you're like, oh, we're doing the same thing. Great, right? But like, I'm curious, right? Like, how can we begin to educate ourselves? And by we, I mean nonprofits, because I think that is a component that is missing, where it's like, and Greg even mentioned this too, right? Like it's this whole mentality of like being okay playing in the same sandbox.
Yeah.
And not thinking like we're competitors, because and he said he had to like work on that internal behavior change and thought process of, oh, we're competing against this organization. When in fact, yes, you are both going after maybe the same funding, but if they get the funding, now you have this direct connection to an organization that can support your community. Even if it's not you, they can still support your community. And so like, how do you think having that conversation, right, to say, okay, Feeding America, you are focused on this thing. And then we have nonprofit B, who is focused on community gardens, and we have nonprofit C, who is focused on policy reform, and we have nonprofit D, right? And like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think, again, we talked about this with the fundraising aspect of things. Funders are wanting collaborations.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
Yeah, that like relationship building and that internal behavior change. Like, I mean, just if we lived in an ideal space, what do you think that would take to restructure those conversations?
Okay, first of all, I'm so glad you said if we lived in an ideal space, because my answer was going to be very high in the sky. And I was going to say, okay, story time, but you set me up. So we're dreaming here. This is not the current state of affairs, which is fine. But let me tell you, the listeners, what I think we really need. I haven't been able to accomplish it yet. I have made some strides, but it's harder than it sounds. So here's what I think we need. Let me start with a story. So I live in Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas has a pretty big nonprofit network, but it's not like one of the hugest, right? Like Houston's bigger, but like we're still like we're pretty big, right? We're not like a rural area. But I was told this story once of, as you know, being in Austin, we have all these tech people coming in from out of state, right? And they're plugging into the scene here, for better or worse. And a lot of people they're coming in from the outside into a new community like Austin. They want to know what nonprofits to invest in their passion areas, right? Like say it is like volunteering, like as a family or something specific. And the question becomes for these people, like, how do you find that data? Well, right now you'd go somewhere like Capital Factory, you talk with people, you network over conversation, you'd ask people, and it's very organic, very relational. And I don't think that is the bad part. For me, the bad part is the inefficiency built in that learning process. And I really want to create literally like an online database systems map, right? To where you see nonprofits in their service areas plugged in on an online map, right? So it's not just so much where you're based. Like for example, I work at One Star. We have a headquarters in Austin, Texas, but our service is statewide. So it's not just in Austin. And so we really need like some kind of map, like let's leverage technology here to plot out the different players in the social change space. So when someone from the outside is really interested in something like, veteran entrepreneurship, they can go and see like, oh, these are the 5 organizations in Austin that work in veteran entrepreneurship. And to my knowledge, I don't think any state really has that. And if someone like, listening online has resources, please like tell us all so we can learn. Like I would love to see like one model done and learn from it. Like that would be amazing, but I don't currently know of one. So I think if you just had a way to identify knowing who's working in similar spaces as me and just knowing their name, then the outreach and stuff could be on you. But right now, even that first step is so hard and it shouldn't be.
I think, and I made this joke to Greg, and I was like, if we had this blank check from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, because of course, public health, right? I'm a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, groupie. And so I'm like, if we could do this thing, right? What would that look like? And so even his response, right, of just like this, a blank check, like, well, it would be leveraging technology. It would be like intentionally changing the conversation from the funding, like from the top down perspective, right? Of like, he works in the Methodist church industry or organization. And so there's still folks that he has to like report up to and get approval from and get sign off on. And like, he's not, even though he's the executive director, he still has folks he answers to beyond his board, right?
Right.
And I think that like exactly what you said is leveraging technology.
Absolutely.
And I feel like, especially being in Austin, right? Being in Austin where we're becoming this like, we're beyond becoming this massive tech hub. And for all of my folks that are in Columbus, Ohio, listen in, perk your ears up, because Columbus is becoming the next.
It's coming.
welcome. And so, right, like even that aspect of things too, of we've talked about in this education and access portion of our conversations of like community networking, interconnectivity of relationships, and leveraging platforms and like truly creating that space, right? And so if it's made, again, I'm going to play a little devil advocate for a second. How do you get people to use it? And by people, I mean the nonprofits, right? Like someone still has to like submit their information. So like if you had to pitch this or use fundraising as a conversation starter of getting nonprofits to like get on board, right? Because I think when nonprofits hear tech, they're like, wait a minute, whoa, that's hard, or that's not really what we do. We love our Excel spreadsheets, right? Like that's a thing. And so like, how would you, right, picking your fundraising expert brain, pitch this to like one star? Like, how could you get that conversation started?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is to say, start at a regional or state level and make sure that model is firm and then go national. I mean, you could always like start national, but that seems like too many variables that could go wrong. And so I would do like a smaller pilot. And I think, one of the key pitches is it gives visibility to nonprofits who normally wouldn't get the visibility. And so, for example, if we're talking about, like I said, let's just continue with veteran entrepreneurship. There's dozens of organizations probably in Austin that do that. And there's probably like 2 you think of, like the biggest ones, right? And that's the same you could say for any of our categories, like, of the bigger ones. And so this would really allow visibility to other ones that maybe you don't know so well. Having a conservation background, which I mentioned in our first meetup, like you can take an example of water quality the same way. Like there's dozens of organizations who work on water quality. You probably know the 2 biggest ones, but something like this, if you allow the mapping of services literally onto a geographic map, you can spread learning quicker and more efficiently to where you may not have a direct connection with that person, but there's still visibility into the great work they're doing. So I think that's really the pitch messaging that, here's the value of something like this. Now, I think the hard part, the hurdle would be, it's a lot of work to maintain something like that. And you want it to be like semi-open access, but we all
Yeah.
know if it's fully open access, like things can go wrong, right? Because I could delete your entry, you could create one that's wrong for me, like, so I think that's like the maintenance piece is kind of the real sticking point.
Mm.
But like we're social change people. We all are dealing with problems. Doesn't mean that we can't figure it out. And I would love to see eventually, if a region or state kind of piloted this and got it to work well, someone like a national independent sector or National Council for Nonprofits would maintain something like this.
Interesting. I know we had talked about even, right, like, because again, I think what I'm hearing from you is like that consistent theme of relationship building, right? Of like creating that connection. Once this platform is built and that that company is now managing it, it's now that, how do you get it to work, right? Like, meaning, how do you get the people to still go talk to each other? Because now that it's there, we've done exactly what Michelle suggests. We've got the council, we've got this national council running it and putting it in place. And everybody has said, we promise to behave ourselves. We're submitting our information, right? And you see this cluster, right? You see your cluster group and you're like, yep, those are my people. That's my group. And then you still have to go and make friends, right? You still have to go and like have that conversation. And I think about this from an entrepreneur's perspective, but like, I don't know that when I was working in nonprofit, we ever had like nonprofit mixers or like nonprofit network groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, is that a thing? Did I just not work in the places that have them?
So that's a great question. And we mentioned this on our intro call of how we met. So we were doing a conference together that was really intended to bring nonprofit professionals and social impact professionals from around the state of Texas together.
Yeah.
And to your point, I don't think a lot of things like that happen enough.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of jumping a little bit into the resources, but we can talk about this more later. There is an entity called the National Council of Nonprofits. And if you go to their website, there's a tab that talks about finding your nonprofit resource center in your state. And so they have a visual map where you can, obviously select your map if you're in the state of Minnesota or California. And if you click on your state, it'll show the nonprofit resource center for that state. So those entities hopefully are thinking about ways to bring people together. And I will say, like, Texas is a big state. So I'll say, like, I admit it's hard to do that like more than once annually, but no matter what state you're in, you should be able to locate your resource center through that. Now, I will say, I think out of the 50 states, there's like 3 that don't have one, but most of them do.
Okay. That's interesting. Yes, because I will say, like, even and again, I'm happy to transition into that resources space because Philanthroforce was as a consultant, right? Like, I had no idea who they were. And if you're not familiar with Philanthroforce, and please, Michelle, correct me if I miss anything, but it's a platform for nonprofits to find consultants that work with nonprofits. Is that right?
Yes, I will say they're fairly new, and you probably have, as equal knowledge on it, but that's to my understanding as well.
And so, like, I think of Philanthroforce, right? And what I'm, or like the TechSoup, right? As well as like that opportunity. But one thing, just to like bring this back to, again, the tech conversation, I noticed there was a lot of organizations that were vendors at the summit that were doing CRM, so the customer relationship management system, which everyone would probably immediately think Salesforce. And funny thing, Salesforce is not, it's too big for nonprofits to integrate into their practices and processes. But and by all means, I've ran into so many small nonprofits that are like, yes, and we have Salesforce. And I'm like, oh.
We have Salesforce at 1 star, so we can chat more about this.
Yes, okay.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
Yeah. And so I just think about this too, right? Like even integrating a CRM into your system or integrating a project management tool into your organization. I feel like those are things that, a robust grants management system, that takes time, effort, energy. I worked for a healthcare technology corporate company, international company. And even with like integrating a electronic health records system into small doctor's offices was like a year-long process because they didn't have a tech person to do this. And so like, again, thinking about resources, even with some of them being free for nonprofits, quickly accessible for nonprofits, like and it takes it back to your conversation around having someone to manage it.
Yeah.
And so like, how can we, or do you have ideas? Because I feel like 1 star is a little bit of a bigger organization, right? How can like small nonprofits or these like startup nonprofits begin to have those conversations? Because if it's at the first phase, you can integrate it now, but like, how do you keep that going? And how do you flexibly shift as tech changes?
Yeah. And I think this is for anyone who's at the precipice of like thinking about this question, which CRM is the best. I don't envy you because I think it's a hard question because there's so many platforms and they continue to grow, which is a very interesting conversation. I think there's some good in that. I think there's some bad in that. A little bit of a left turn side rant. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, probably more than I should be. Natalie sees me on there. And I think that just the presence of the nonprofit tech companies in general is something I think a lot about. It's not that we don't need them. I'm not sure we need that many of them. And it's interesting because, I was just saying, but the force of the market, it's going to like tell you what's successful, what's not successful. So I don't know, like maybe there's just a need to have so many differentiated ones and that's what people want. And maybe that's what the consumer is saying. But I personally feel like, in my 15 years of being a nonprofit, it's quite overwhelming now how many there are. And you get a lot of decision fatigue just trying to sort through the different ones. So with that being said, I think it is management, like to make sure that you're putting good data in and like using data in a very strategic way. That does take an acknowledgement that data is important. I think too that clean data is important. And
what do you mean by that, Michelle, when you say clean data? I feel like Salesforce is going to be another conversation here in a second. So what do you mean? Not to cut you off, but I feel like for those who are new to that conversation or beginning to learn it, when you say clean data, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think that it's about the way you're inputting data in a way that not only is consistent with existing data sets in your CRM, but is also forward-looking. So you're thinking that this format is the format that is going to be the best use for us. Because, sometimes you do have to change things. Like, maybe you add a new field, like you're collecting a new type of data that you didn't collect 5 years ago. And there's nothing wrong with small shifts like that. But making sure that your format is consistent. And I'm talking about even like notes, like even donor notes, for example. It doesn't have to be like the format of your field date per se, something that simple, although that's important too. I think it's really having a forward look on understanding how reports are exported so you can know how data is pulled and then format it that way on the input side of things. So it's making the output much more clean, but also like meaningful, because we don't have time to go through and like rearrange data in your reports and like to make it mean something. Like, we're busy people, we need to work with the system we have.
Yeah. Yeah. So data storytelling.
Total data storytelling.
Right. Like, and I think that's just, especially during COVID, right? Like I worked local government on the response, and we had a dashboard and we had specific data that we had to collect. And I'm tying this all back to the story, because we knew what we needed to tell our community and we knew how we needed to collect that. And so that was how we were able to, aggregate our data and pull all of those appropriate reports and then load them into this dashboard that then told a story to our community that was what they needed to see and hear. Right. And I think that's like, I feel like that ties back to fundraising, that ties back to your strategic plan, that ties back to your sustainability, that ties back to your commitment to your mission, to your community, right? Like all of this is, what data do you need to pull to tell your community what you're doing?
Yep.
You struggle with those. And I remember I was saying like, okay, what are your KPIs? And I realized that was like corporate lingo. And I was like, okay, what are your OKRs, right? And then still there was this moment of like, for which grant? And I'm like, no, as an organization.
Right.
Right? Like, what as an organization have you
as
said?
a program, how are you tracking your success?
Yes. And I feel like that question right there, right, is one of the most prominent questions when it comes to fundraising or planning, which we'll talk about in our next episode. But just like, can you give some insight and around this like education piece, right? This conversation we're having around education of how to, one, make sure that the story you are telling with your data is relative and relevant to what you've like said success looks like, because you have to know what your success looks like in order to like go from point A to point Z.
Yeah.
And so how do you do that? How do you tell that story?
I think for me, it starts internally with a real meaty but honest conversation of, where are we really trying to move the needle? And again, we were talking about social change organizations not being able to attack every angle of a systemic issue. And that's holds true in this example, right? Like, you can only do what your specification is allowing you to do with the professionals you have on staff, the unique insight you have on staff, what your mission statement is. So I think that start of this, the answer to your question is thinking internally, where are we really trying to move the needle? And for me, I feel quite comfortable starting with a question like, one I love, this is actually one of my favorites, is, and this is like at a program level, not necessarily organization, but you could say organization. Sure. It's easier to do with the program. Is if there was a press release that came out and, it was describing how successful this program is, what would that be? And so now that we have Zoom and virtual documents like Google Docs, this is so fun to do like in a group live. Like, what would we be saying about ourselves? So let's say like the veteran entrepreneurship example, like what would this press release say? Like, what would we be really proud of accomplishing? That we expended X amount of funds, that we created a new conference, that we are focusing on Black entrepreneurs because nobody else is, because whatever, like you need to really like think from the end first and then track it back. Because I feel like with theory of changes, which is just really just like a more fun way to kind of address a theory of change, we start from the input and then go to the outcome, which I always start with the outcome last of what do we really want to achieve, and then think, back it out. Okay, so if that's true, then what has to be done here? And I think for both of us now, like we have a project manager mentality. So that's like what you do in project management, right? Like you have your end goal, and then you backtrack everything. What else has to be true for this to be done on this date? what has to lead up to this. So I really love that approach, because I think if we make it fun, like what would this press release say that's defining our success? Like how do we talk about ourselves? Would we collect quotes from certain people? It really gets us into thinking, what do we need to do to make this happen?
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel like it here, and I'd be curious to hear your experience. I feel like as a fundraiser, we had to make it really clear that you have to have SMART goals, right? Like metrics, like numbers, like it has to actually be trackable. And I think we get lost in this social change world because we're like, well, what can we really track? It's like, yes, you can. You can track qualitative education. You can track, like, you can track these things. And so I feel like there's this sense of like, well, what we're doing, we can't really track. And it's like, no, you can track it.
No, and I feel like exactly what you're saying, right? And as a public health student, I had to do a research methods class. And I will never forget, I told my professor, Dr. Roseman, now Dr. Jackson, who's a fantastic human, she's just brilliant. I was like, yeah, I don't do quant. It's just not what I don't do it. I don't like it. I'm not really trying to do all of this. And she was like, oh, okay, so show me an an impact study with just qualitative metrics. And I was like, not a problem. It's not a problem at all. I can do that. Challenge accepted.
I'll be back soon.
And girl, it was soon. It was real soon. I was like, hey, so can I, you have office hours coming up, right? We should talk about this paper that I'm writing because it doesn't make any sense. And so I had to realize, right, like I needed both quantitative data and qualitative data. And I had to figure out like exactly what you said. And I know we hadn't planned on like touching on this, but it's strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's your strategic plan. Like, what is your big thing that you're going to be doing? Because that's the end. And that's what you write down. And then you backtrack and you say, okay, these initiatives are going to address that end mark. These objectives are what we're going to work to get to that initiative, which goes back to that end mark. And then here's all of the data that we're going to collect. Here's the squishy, mushy data, as my epidemiologist friends would say. This is mushy data, AKA qualitative data. And then you have your like hard data, which is your quantitative data, right? Your metrics that you can actually put in and measure. True and true, right? We served 50 out of the 300 people we said we were going to serve. That is your hard data. Like, you can't make that up, right? You really did it. But like, of those 50 people that we served, we supported them with X, Y, and Z, right? And that is that little bit more of a fluffy thing because we supported them, but we may or may not have actually moved the needle for them.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we can still take that, say we worked towards our initiative's goals, and then show based on our strategy that we put in place for the year that this is what we accomplished. Like, we might have missed the mark a little bit but I think along the way, one of the things like Greg and I talked about, and I don't know if we went into it too deep, but you've mentioned it multiple times of like being comfortable saying what you're not good at.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, right? Like, when that happens, where I would correlate that to barriers that you've come across along the way. And that's okay, right? Like, I think even acknowledging that, like, we did everything we absolutely could, but this barrier, like, our building flooded. And so therefore we could not continue to host this class to cover the other 250 people. And we had to transition it to virtual. So now we didn't have the same access to folks that we thought we were going to have. And we were only able to get to half of that population, right?
Yeah.
Like, but being able to like capture that full picture. And then I think, again, taking this back to that funding side of things, where you can say, hey, funder, we did the best we could. Our building's broken, but we did do this and we did do this. And then we put these strategies in place to now shift our community folks, our participants, to this other place that we've built a relationship with, right? And so like, I feel like that fluidity of what I just explained is the biggest challenge of like pulling it in.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think that it ties into the mindset again that we're approaching these problems. And I'll tell a quick story to tie all of this together. And I won't mention any organization names, but I was working for an organization that was applying for pretty significant grant funding for a disease for within a certain animal, and it was like a disease mitigation strategy, right? And I was working closely with the science team, and like we had proposed a certain mitigation strategy that we were hoping was going to reduce disease. And you collect your results and you realize like it didn't reduce it to the level that we had anticipated when the strategy was put forth and they went out in the field, and saw that it didn't increase the disease, but it also didn't reduce it near as much as we thought. And I remember like the program staff being so disappointed, not just because of the results, but also thinking about like the messaging of that, like it was just like heartbreaking for them. And I think for me, as a fundraiser, I had to say, but you can't guarantee outcomes. And I think as a nonprofit, right, like we're trying to do the best we can with the information we have at the time. And we are making progress, knowing that certain disease mitigation strategies don't work is data. Like now we know, okay, let's try something different or try it in a different season, etc. But I think for me, the real take home message was we take all of this on ourselves to figure out, and if we don't feed the 500 people we said we were going to, regardless of like all of these unforeseen circumstances that happen to us, like we have this guilt about that. And I feel like this is something so much in that base layer that the nonprofit foundation is built on, is we're trying to solve all these things. And I think for me, I always want us to remind ourselves gently that we didn't create these problems. It's not all on us to fix everything. This is a societal problem. This is not this one organization's problem, and gosh, you failed because you didn't solve this in 2 years. Like, come on, get real. Like that's, but I think that's how we feel.
Yeah.
And I also think that because we feel like that, we are hesitant to put down specific outcomes we're trying to achieve in the chance that we don't achieve it, which in reality, I want to cheerlead all of us on, saying we are doing the work. Our heart is in the right place. We are passionate people and we are changing things. Have we fixed every problem in the world? No, we have not. But I think the amount that we actually have changed is just an untold story. Like who's telling that story? Like, I don't know, because I never hear it. I think I always hear, how do we do better? And it's like, sure, like we could all optimize ourselves, right? But I think we have to also be gentle with ourselves and show ourselves as much love as we show the social change problems we're trying to fix.
Wow. And I know this is, I feel like how most of our conversations go, like they just flow into this space and place. And I feel like I remember being back in Columbus working on the opioid epidemic that has run rampant through Columbus. I mean, and Ohio as a whole. And I'm serving on these different task forces that are trying to address a variety of different things, right? It's where it's coming from. It's clean needles. It's methadone clinics. It's everything you can think of, and different strategies and parts. And the task force that was brought together was very holistic in its approach, right? But like, I don't know that I could tell you what impact that task force made. Even though I sat at that table and we had those conversations, right? And it still felt like we were just running up against a wall because people were dying every day. I mean, like kids were dying every day. And we were just like, we're sitting at a table. What are we doing? Now, mind you, we weren't talking about like the $60 million that Ohio State had brought in to this task force because of this task force over 3 years to address this problem. Now, granted, I left before I figured out what they did with it, but it's that piece, right? Of like, when you're passionate, and I feel like you, Greg, everyone in that nonprofit space, when you are passionate about something and you don't see the needle moved, it is like a gut punch, because you're like, well, what the hell am I doing? Right? Or like, what were we doing? And how do I continue to be passionate when I don't feel like I'm doing anything?
Yeah.
And I really, really appreciate like the fact that you have mentioned this, and it's something that I know we've talked about before. It's a systemic issue. Like, we could not possibly fix a thing that we didn't do, right? That we didn't break. But then also, like, there are so many things and barriers in place that we don't even know about, that we're trying to quote unquote like fight against or overturn or address. And I think just generally too, right? Like, being mindful that we all can't fix and force, I think I should say, systemic problems to be corrected, because they're there for a reason, right? We could totally go on a theoretical rant of like what they're in place to do, right? Like, taking this back to like the 70s, 60s, 50s, right? We can go all the way back. But I'm saying all of this to say, like, I think that it is such a relatable conversation that I don't know if there's ever a moment in a meeting when we're like, how are we going to fix this thing? How are we going to fix this thing? How are we going to fix this thing? And we keep asking and asking and asking, when there's this moment where somebody's like, calling me real quick, we can't fix it because we aren't in the place to fix it. We aren't the council, the city council. We aren't the local government. We aren't the state government. We aren't the federal government, right? Like, but I think that the point that I want to make is the work we are doing can absolutely tell the story that supports changing what they do.
Yeah.
I think about this, there's a methodology in public health called a policy systems environmental change approach. And from your conservation background, right, this is like, you do this environmental study, right? And then it is specifically targeting a system within your ecosystem. And then from that study, you now identify certain policies at a variety of different levels to say, if you fix these, if you correct these, what we just fixed will not continue to happen. And like, it's powerful. It's an extremely powerful thing. I want to use this example because I would love to hear from your conservation brain. So there was a nonprofit in LA County who did some research, and they realized that their high school students in this area, LA County's massive, but like in this area of their community, the type 2 diabetes prevalence was like through the roof for high school students. And so they did some research and they studied their environment, and they realized that as these students were walking home, part one, school lunch was gross. So they didn't eat school lunch. Check one. Two, within their community, they ended up having like fast food restaurant after fast food restaurant within like a 2-mile radius. That was their only options, plus convenience stores, right? So they're picking up a jug juice, Takis, a honey bun, and some French fries, and that's their meal for the day. And I'm sure there was like maybe not that brands, but just in general, like they pulled that data, right? And so what they ended up doing was putting affordable fresh food within that radius. So when they were walking home, they had options. And like, I'm assuming this is like relating it to like, doubling up your food stamps at like a farmer's market, right? Like you got a little bit more out of your dollar by going to the fresh foods. Okay. The end of this study, they had like decreased the type 2 diabetes prevalence by 33%. And what they ended up saying was, by doing what we're suggesting, local ordinance, is that for every 2 fast food restaurants, there must be an affordable fresh food option. And so everything and they got it passed. They got this local ordinance passed. And so now in that community, there is a fresh food option that is affordable within their these students walk home. But that meant that like these fast food joints had to find other places to go.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm just like, now granted, it took 3 years. It was quite an intense study. It took a lot of work to like change high school students' behaviors, right? Like they had incentives of doing this. But thinking about like your experience, from a holistic view, can you think of a way to take these evidence-based methodologies, educate nonprofit organizations, develop out a strategic plan around a systemic concern within their community, and then like rolling out that conversation with like an inclusive data process, with a fundraising process, and like with this end goal of we're going to do the best we can with what we've got, but we know that we're going to try to move the needle in this specific thing.
Yeah. Let me first react to your story because I love it so much. I think it's so illustrative of what we should be doing. And like sometimes it's so easy to pair good data with policy, because so much of the reason that we exist as nonprofits is because of legislation, right? Like if not like 100% of nonprofits, like probably could be argued that the reason they exist is because of legislation. And I will say, so this kind of ties into this interesting stat of nationally all nonprofits, when asked how much they participate in advocacy work, that less than 5% of nonprofits do. And so this, we don't have to go into a deep thing about advocacy and lobbying, but advocacy is really educating and talking about why you're doing what you're doing as a nonprofit with legislators. Lobbying is more like bill specific, like we would like you to pass House Bill 123,
yes,
for example.
thank
So you can advocate as a nonprofit. And I think it's so interesting that less than 5% of us do this, because to your beautiful story point, we are oftentimes as nonprofits closest to the communities and the problems. And we have data sometimes that we're just not sharing up, and I'm like, wow, like that's a missed opportunity. So you should be asking yourself, well, how can I advocate more? Like, how do I do that? And if you're in Texas, the answer is easy. So at One Star, we have a joint initiative with United Ways of Texas called Texas Nonprofit Strong, to where we watch when legislation is active, like we watch certain bills, kind of tell you if you're a nonprofit, these are the things that are probably going to impact you the most. So that's good to have someone like just digest everything that's happening during legislation. I mean, it's a lot to keep track of. There's like thousands of bills, right? So who has time for that unless you work in politics? So for Texas Nonprofit Strong, the initiative is something to follow. We have an e-newsletter, so feel free to sign up for that. If you're outside of Texas, again, I'm going to direct you to that National Council of Nonprofits site. And if you find like your nonprofit resource center, no matter what state you're in, unless you're like in the 3 states that don't have one, you can click on your state. It'll show you that resource center. And most of them do advocacy training, prep, active work and advocacy at the state level. Okay. So definitely you can plug in there, and they track like for example, the Texas legislator, we have certain bills that are very specific to Texas that, we should be aware of, and other states have, very nuanced scenarios going on. So definitely wanted to plug that in for people. But I think to your question about like fundraising plan and strategy, again, I conceptualize all this around like theory of change. Those are the words I like. I think there's other, phrases that we can use. We're all kind of talking about the same thing. But I think really having that firmed up before you go into funder conversations is critical, because as nonprofits, we often hear what happens when you kind of like write a narrative to a specific funder's request. But if you have your own requests outlined before going into that, then this is a fit for me, or like, no, like this, we weren't even trying to track these KPIs. So like, I don't even want to track something like this. So know like what you're trying to track before you go looking for grants or apply for one. Because if you're firm in what you can do and what you can't do, then it filters out grants so much easier.
Yeah. So, and again, like, I don't even think that this was a conversation we were going to have around grants, right? But like, ideally, right, you see you're a nonprofit organization, you need funding, and you're like, yep, I'm going to shift our mindset, our mission, our vision, our programming to meet this dollar amount. And then you spend copious amounts of time trying to shift into a thing that you're not.
Yeah.
And like in my grant writing space, right, like one of the first questions I typically ask a client or someone that's interested in getting a grant is, what is the program that you're trying to fund? And if they can tell me that, then my next question is, what is the budget? And that is typically where they get caught up.
There's some friction in that question.
It is. They're like, well, it's whatever we need it to be. I'm like, wrong answer. Nope. Because if it's a $5 million grant and your budget is $750,000, what are you doing? That is a huge difference in what you have said your program is doing and what you want your program to do. And so then it becomes this conversation around like scalability. Like, is your program $750 a year? Because then, okay, we can probably scale that to like $1 million, hire some more people, build out your initiative. But if it's really $750 as a whole, how do you plan to get to that 5 mil, right? Like, and so I 1,000% feel you on that, right? With like, if it's really not in your wheelhouse, don't force it, because then it's a money grab.
Yeah.
And then it's a waste of time.
And also be open to like partnerships on grants too, right? Like maybe it's a $5 million budget, you have 750,000, but there's 3 other partners who should be on this grant. Like, don't act like you're gonna do the work alone, So I think like, let's normalize that.
No, I feel like, like literally every part of our conversations have been about relationships.
They really have. This is the connecting thread between all of these.
I mean, even with Greg, he's like, yeah, I don't know what somebody across town is doing because I don't have a network set up, right? So like your suggestion to having this statewide map that has all of your nonprofits on one place, like I can click and find and see and hover and know, was exactly what he was saying, right? Like, I don't know what everybody else is doing. And then again, if I don't know what everybody else is doing, then how do I build that relationship? Because I don't know if I should be talking to them for real or like just to talk to them.
Yep.
And so I'm just like, I know we have talked about like mixers, bringing everybody together, right? Like, granted, yes, Texas is, I say this constantly, the size of 2.5 European countries. Like, it's huge.
It's big.
Yeah, okay. Never. I was gonna go down a whole tangent of like the trip of me getting here and getting excited because and you'll probably enjoy this even more. I got to Dallas and I was like, I'm almost there. And every person that is a Texan, and I'm like, I got to Dallas and they're like, but you live in Austin. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, you had a ways to go.
Yep.
I did. It's like someone, and I will like, just as like a random statement, originally being from Ohio, it took me like an hour and a half to get from like Columbus to Cleveland or Columbus to Cincinnati. It took me 4 hours to get to Chicago. 5. Took me 4 to 5 hours just from Dallas to Austin. So if anyone is curious how big Texas is, that's it. And that's not even including traffic.
Yeah, exactly. Like I have friends who like will be presenting at conferences in Dallas and they're like, oh, maybe you can just like drop in. I'm like, no, I love you and I'm glad you're here. But like that's a long drop for me from Austin to back. So you're so right. Yeah.
Just to drop in. Like
just
that's
to drop in. There's no just
spending the night.
in.
No, this is a night out. Like we have a night bag packed. I'm staying over. I don't care what anybody says, like, not to drive and back. No, ma'am. But yeah, right. Like just like thinking about ways to build relationships. And I know, again, we've talked about, I remember we were planning this and you were like, one of the things you didn't mention was LinkedIn, and like, I don't know if you're familiar with like Mighty Networks.
Yes. Yeah, I think, yeah, I know there.
The app. Okay. And so like ideas of ways that relationships can be built, that communities can be developed across initiatives, right? Like that creating some intersectionality, just like you said, like if there is that $5 million grant and you do this one thing really well, and you need to go find somebody else that does something else really well. What are some ways, like, right? Like if we just decided, at the end of this podcast session, we're just going to start a Mighty Network, or we're just going to start a LinkedIn community or something along those lines, right? Like, how do we begin that conversation? Or is it really at the organizational level that we'd have to do that?
Well, within this conversation, you let me talk about my dream, so maybe we can end on a dream too.
Done and done.
I have a dream of what would satisfy this question. I don't have it done yet, but I am in a Slack channel that's international and it has 7,000 people in it. I've seen the beauty of that, and it is the community-centric fundraising Slack channel. So if you are interested in equity in fundraising and want to be a part of it, let me know, and I'm happy to send you an invite to it. But I've really been able to witness how people organically connect over things that, is of interest to them. And there are so many people on this channel. So my dream is that we create a nonprofit or social change, doesn't have to be 501c3s, like a social change channel by state is what I'm thinking. Okay. So I would love like Texas to pilot something like this because, revisiting our last theme of leveraging technology to make relationships work better for you. Like you can't meet everyone, even if it was in Ohio, like it's so hard to connect with everyone, and we're in Texas and it's impossible. Yeah. So, I think there's kind of patterning it off of what I've seen on the community-centric fundraising Slack channel. You have sub-channels by region. You may have like a CEO channel, a new CEO channel. You have a marketing and communications group. You have grant writing tips. Like we would create the channels that we think make the most sense for us. And you'd be able to have like that peer-to-peer learning, which I think is really like the thing like we're all creating, because we don't all need a consultant or a public speaker to stand up and tell us how to do things. Honestly, our peers probably could tell us so much of what they've learned by being a professional in this social change space, just as much as any, keynote or thought leader, which no shame to those people. Like I'm a presenter too, but I also know some of the best things I've learned have been from peers in my network. And I so want that like for people. So that's my dream. I'm ending on the, Texas-wide channel for people that are interested in social change. Like, let's make this happen.
Thank you for that. And I've been having this conversation. I wrote a LinkedIn article on it about let's build our own tables. Yes. And I just had someone remind me last night, like, Natalie, why are you on the search for a thing? Like you're searching for this community or this cohort or something along that lines, like just build your own table.
Yeah.
And it was this like, I did say that before, right? And so I'm like, I am 1000% on board, right? With like, and anyone that's listening, who is interested in like building our own table, of creating this space. You can be a disruptor, you can be a challenger, you can be in the nonprofit, for-profit, entrepreneurial, whatever it might be. And you're like, yep, Michelle's got it. I'm 1000% here for it. I have some extra time. I want to build this network. I'm in Texas, right? Wherever you are, maybe you're not in Texas, right? Wherever it is, and you're like, I want to build, I want to create, I want to develop, and I want to have this table. I challenge everyone that's listening to go after it, right? Like find us. I'll constantly keep putting Michelle's information in our show notes, my information, obviously in the show notes. And I really, really think being able to say we're building our own table, we are bringing solutions. We don't know if these solutions are right, but we're willing to be wrong, but try. Like
Yep.
with real intention and not say like, well, we kind of did. No, we're like, we are bringing big ideas to this conversation, and we are pulling in subject matter experts from all different realms and walkways, paths, to have these conversations with us. And I think that is just an extremely powerful place to be, even if it's through a Slack channel. Right? Like that can absolutely be our table. It doesn't, granted, now, if someone is listening and they're a massive investor and they want to just like fund this for Michelle, also
Okay.
we're not going to say no to that. We're not going to say no. But yeah, like, right, like this is our start to that conversation and to push it to being a reality. So yeah, no, that was like a super powerful way to end this. I know this session was a little bit longer than all of the rest of them that we've done, but I wanted to make sure we captured more of an organic flow of ways to address things in nonprofit. And it's really just community. It's not just a nonprofit, right? It's really in our community, bringing folks together, educating folks, changing those behaviors, right? Tapping into things that we're not typically comfortable in doing. And I think that that's just such a powerful conversation to have. And I feel like we covered like so many different things.
So many things.
This is how our planning sessions typically go, right? I'm like, oh, Michelle, I have this idea. And she's like, yep. And then we get this other thing going. And then there's like this whole other topic happening. And we've built like a book by the end of a 30-minute call. But Michelle, thank you for joining us again. I know we have one more session with you and maybe like another series planned. We'll see how it goes and your flexibility and time. But oh my gosh, thank you again for letting us pick your brain and hear your advice and your knowledge.
It was so much fun. Thank you for being in the conversation with me.
Absolutely. Thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.